Recording now.
All right. Joey, I think I know what happened.
What was it?
The system just decided to update.
Of course it did.
Then wouldn't let me start, of course.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Because it informs me now that it's updated. Dave, you want to wait a few more minutes? Or?
Yeah, just a couple minutes here.
Yeah, okay.
I love the typesetting on the invitation, by the way. It looks very real.
It does.
Real, huh?
Real. Did you like the Gershwin too?
That was a nice touch. We'll just wait a couple more minutes, Gabe, and
Sure.
everybody get settled in here. And welcome, everyone. We'll get ready here in just a few minutes.
So Joey, you're going to control the flow of the slides?
Yeah. You just let me know, and I'll change the slide. It's already recording. The chat should be open for Q&A. We're good to go.
Yeah, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Gabe, are you
Sure.
ready?
Ready.
Great. All right, well, welcome everyone to our November 19th talk and Zoom. And I have the pleasure of introducing Gabe. I wanted to address a couple of things first. If you could please mute yourselves for the duration of the talk. And let Gabe have the floor, and then we'll open it up after, when Gabe's finished, we'll open up for a brief time of Q&A. And if you like, please go ahead and enter your questions or comments in the chat, and we can address those at the end of the talk, or you'll be welcome to unmute yourself and come on and ask a question directly to Gabe. And I want to thank you all for being here. The Ruskin Art Club is active, almost active as we ever have been now with Zoom, I'd say. And so it's been great to be able to connect with all of you through these wonderful talks. If you've been able to attend them, they're fantastic. I think we are recording them, and eventually we'll post them, I believe. Yes. So I do hope that you're able to join us, continue to join us as we get these great speakers to contribute to a wonderful body of work that we'll have collected at the Ruskin Art Club. You can, as you can see on the slide there, check in on anything Ruskin Art Club at theartclub.com, ruskinartclub.com. And there you can sign up. If you're not a member, you can sign up to be a member. And we would love to have you as a member of the Ruskin Art Club. It's a fantastic organization, and we really have a great group of people that share wonderful ideas, and now in a time probably more than ever is needed by all of us, I think. So it's a really wonderful group, and you'd enjoy participating in our events. So tonight we have the wonderful Gabriel Meyer, who's been kind of the longest pillar of the Ruskin Art Club that I can remember. My family goes way back in the Ruskin Art Club, and so it's great to have him. I do want to mention quickly too about the invitations that have been going out. I want to thank the Stuart and Beverly Denenberg for those wonderful invitations. They're fantastic to get in the mail. It's like opening a little piece of mail, and so I want to compliment Stuart and Beverly for sending those out, and thank them very much. And also want to thank all of you that have paid for these talks. We ask for donations, and if you can afford to make a small donation for the talks, that's much appreciated, and goes to a good cause. So we thank you for any donations you're able to make. So tonight, Gabriel Meyer, most of you know him one way or another. He has many circles and many talents, and so you are probably in touch with one of those. But Gabe is a poet journalist, an award-winning foreign correspondent who has lived and worked throughout the Middle East, the Balkans, and East Africa. He was especially acclaimed for his coverage of the First Palestinian Intifada and of the Bosnian War. His reporter's diary of the civilian war in Sudan, War and Faith in Sudan, won Forward Magazine's Book of the Year award for essays in 2006. He was awarded an honorary doctorate in recognition of his work as a journalist by the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at UC Berkeley in 2017. He has published poetry and 2 novels, a large-scale nonfiction work, The Testimony of Stones, a biography of Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's awaiting publication now. He's been involved with the historic Ruskin Art Club since 1998 and currently serves as its executive director and fearless leader. He is a companion of the Guild of St. George, and this wonderful talk, I believe, was born out of a talk at the Huntington, Gabe, perhaps, and I'll turn the floor over to you, and thank you very much for presenting tonight.
Dave, thanks so much for that introduction. Yes, as you said, this is what I'm doing tonight is a version of the lecture I gave at the Huntington Library a year ago as part of the bicentennial of Ruskin's birth conference, John Ruskin, 19th Century Prophet, 21st Century, 19th Century Visionary, 21st Century Prophet. But during the Huntington Library Conference, as those of you who were there will remember, we had a very, very tight schedule. So I had to fit this into a very tight time slot. So what you're getting tonight is the unexpurgated version of this material. So I'm feeling a little freer to spread my wings a bit with this and elaborate on some points that I wasn't able to get into last year. So we're calling this talk Ruskin and the California Dream. The California Dream, like most dreams, finds its origins in a nightmare. One doesn't have to dig very deeply in the literature about the settling of the American West to pick up what we might call the redemptive strain. The California Dream, a dream of ubiquitous opportunities, endless summers, and fresh starts, may have begun in James Marshall's 1848 discovery of a gold nugget in John Sutter's sawmill and the onset of the gold rush. But it found its true raison d'etre in the national longing for rejuvenation and renewal that emerged in the wake of the Civil War. I'm going to be referring, as I go through, to my trusted research assistant, Joey, who will take us through the technological challenges of this presentation so we can move on. Yeah, Joey, can you advance the slide there? There we go. I'm indebted to my friend, the distinguished historian, there we go. I'm indebted to my friend, the distinguished historian, William Deverill, for this insight, for the often neglected connections between the fratricide of America's greatest tragedy and the lure of the pristine and uncontaminated West. Bill, who serves as the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, has laid out this thesis in a number of essays and books, most recently his book To Bind Up the Nation's Wounds, The American West After the Civil War. But he also fascinated us more than a decade ago with a lecture to the Ruskin Art Club on this topic, on the factors that led the founders of the Ruskin Art Club to Los Angeles in the late 1880s. As Bill writes in a 2007 essay entitled Redemptive California, Rethinking the Post-Civil War, quote, Americans, Northerner and Southerner alike, moved west in the post-war era in part because of the Civil War, because they wanted to get away, because they wanted to heal physically, emotionally, or otherwise. And most of them came on the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, if anything, a device by which the nation was supposed to be drawn together after the war, a gigantic suture tying the torn asunder North and South, end quote. That railroads serve as the catalyst of the dream should come as no surprise. What is remarkable and germane to our discussion is the language politicians and preachers used to describe the meeting of the rails. Quote, hail then all hail, an orator exclaimed at the Central Pacific Railroad groundbreaking in Sacramento in 1863. Quote, this auspicious hour, hail this bond of brotherhood and union, hail this marriage tie between the Atlantic and the Pacific, all hail this bow of promise, the symbol, the harbinger, and I'm underlining this, the pledge of a higher civilization and an ultimate and worldwide peace, end quote. A preacher took this even further in his remark that with the railroad, quote, the new Jerusalem is coming down from heaven and will switch off in Oakland. In popular culture, the lure of California as a land of millennial dreams was aptly caricatured in W.C. Field's classic 1934 comedy, It's a Gift. The plot, if plot is the word I want, centers on the hapless Harold Bissonnet, who insists on pronouncing his name Bissonnet, at least when his wife is present, shades of Hyacinth Bucket. A struggling New Jersey grocer who had his heart set on buying a California orange ranch and living a sunshine-filled life of ease. After 1,000 vexations, as only W.C. Fields can be vexed, he finally achieves his aim, and the final scene finds him alone and out of doors, effortlessly plucking an orange from an overhanging branch, squeezing a little orange juice into the glass before he adds something much, much stronger from the flask, a look of triumphant self-satisfaction on his face. While the California dream has many components, once the rails made it feasible, people came to California seeking health, especially for pulmonary ailments or adventure or freedom to pursue one's own version of happiness. But again, we miss much if we fail to understand the redemptive character of many of these hopes, the pledge of a higher civilization, because these redemptive hopes would prove fertile ground for idealistic movements and dreams of social reinvention that would come to characterize the California of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and play a not inconsiderable role even today in the idea of California as a place of social and artistic experiment. While we can cite many influences on pre-World War I California's array of social and religious movements, John Ruskin holds an honorable and often neglected place among these influences. Joy, you next. In a few cases, Ruskin had a direct influence, but on many, many more, that influence was more diffuse. As a thinker whose books, or at least quotations from them, were widely cited, whose ideas were in the air. Before we describe a few of the ways Ruskin influenced aspects of the California dream, and Ruskin's impact on Southern California in particular, it's helpful to consider Ruskin's broader impact on 19th century America. Given the constraints of time, this can only hope to be the most cursory of sketches. For someone who never set foot on these shores, the formative influence Ruskin wielded on American artists and thinkers in the 19th century is both remarkable and remarkably underreported. Last year's bicentennial celebrations went some distance in correcting that neglect. Among other events, I'm thinking of the recent exhibition, The American Pre-Raphaelites Radical Realists, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which featured the work of a large and important group of artists coalesced around the journal The New Path, who tried to realize a specifically Ruskinian vision in mid-19th century America. Ted Bosley, who's with us tonight, mentioned that he had a copy of the New Path that I believe your family had picked up many years ago in the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco. The New Path, published by the Society for the Advancement of Truth in Art. I can't resist mentioning in this context a quote from a letter Ruskin wrote to his friend and confidant Charles Eliot Norton, the legendary professor of art history at Harvard, about his American expatriate friends, the Alexanders, who had settled in Florence. Quote, Ruskin told Norton clearly in a teasing panic that he had actually been obliged to run away from Florence and the two precious American women there, Mrs. and Miss Alexander, lest I should be converted into an American citizen. Francesca Alexander, the Miss Alexander here, went on to dedicate herself to an intense fusion of drawing and text in handmade books that made her one of the most original of Ruskin's American disciples. We have an example of her work here. We should also note in this connection that a significant number of American artists who modeled themselves after aspects of Ruskin's aesthetic program, and with his encouragement, were women. I am thinking here particularly of Fidelia Bridges, seen here with her painting equipment. And there's also a painting here of hers, yes, the Keller Lily, which is a wonderful piece. Part of Ruskin's impact can be traced to the parade of influential American artists and intellectuals who visited the Victorian master on his home turf and on the continent, and those American artists who actually studied under Ruskin. We've mentioned Norton, but there was what we might call the Norton Circle. Artists such as Charles Herbert Moore, who studied drawing under Ruskin in the 1870s and was later director of the Fogg Museum, and the group of Ruskinians who painted in Italy. Moore, Henry Newman, Harold Broadfield Warren, Denman Ross, and Joseph Lyndon Smith. These are all examples of the work of these Ruskinian artists, many of whom were sent to Italy on assignment by Ruskin to draw aspects of monuments that were in danger of being restored by local renovators. And Ruskin would send his disciples to various cities in Italy to record original doorways and architectural features that he feared were slated for destruction. We talked last week about the Mercato Vecchio in Florence. Oh, this is Newman's drawings of the Mercato before it was taken down. Many of these American Ruskinians later assumed positions of leadership in American art institutes, particularly the influential nexus of Harvard, the Fogg Museum, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and in the formation of arts curricula in American universities. They helped to popularize Ruskin's perspectives on what I like to call precision seeing, and the approach to drawing elucidated in his 1857 masterpiece, The Elements of Drawing, and later in The Elements of Perspective for generations of American art students. Norton's colleague, Harold Warren, championed Ruskin's theories at the Harvard School of Architecture well into the 20th century until his long tenure ended in 1930. The enthusiasm of these Americans under Ruskin's tutelage may be gauged from a letter Moore wrote to Norton in 1876, quote, "To come directly here and be driven, as I was, in Mr. Ruskin's carriage to Rydal Mount on the second day was a truly delightful introduction to dear old England. Mr. Ruskin spent the 2 mornings in giving me most valuable instruction, drawing for me with his own hand and giving me precisely the help that I have all my life been longing for," end quote. Echoing a famous remark by Charlotte Bronte, Moore wrote simply that, "By the mercy of God, Ruskin has been sent to open our eyes." Let me suggest a particularly striking example of the work of these American artistic pilgrims to Ruskin. A 1903 bronze portrait of John Ruskin by the American sculptor Gutzon Borglum of Mount Rushmore fame. We spoke a little bit about this last week. Actually, this is the version of the Borglum bronze that currently is at Brentwood, Ruskin's estate in the Lake Country, a gift of American Ruskinians to their British counterparts last year during the bicentennial. The bronze shows a seated Ruskin in his great coat with a heavy lap robe over his legs, with one hand resting on a book, as one contemporary critic put it, in monumental repose. The statuette is based on sketches Borglum did from life in the late 1890s. Moving on, there's a portrait of Borglum here that, there we go. The young Borglum, who had studied painting initially with California Impressionist William Keith in the 1880s, went to Europe with his wife in 1889 and enrolled in the Académie Julienne in Paris, and switched while there from painting to sculpture. Like so many other American sculptors, he fell under the influence of Rodin, as the bronze we just saw so amply demonstrates. Borglum was introduced to Ruskin by the organist H.S. Roberts and invited by Roberts to visit Ruskin at his estate in the Lake District at Brentwood, probably in 1897, just 3 years before Ruskin's death in 1900. I'm now going to quote from Willadine Price's 1961 biography of Borglum, Gutzon Borglum, the Man Who Carved a Mountain. Quote, while Ruskin and Roberts talked, Borglum studied Ruskin and made several sketches of him. He found that Ruskin had drawn into himself. He knew his worth. He had full confidence in his own strength, but he was sad. The most marvelous, magnificent, unappreciated genius the world has ever known. Deeply impressed, Borglum told his wife, as soon as I have time, I will make a statue of Ruskin. End quote. Borglum returned to the United States in 1902, now separated from his wife. Elizabeth Jane returned to LA, eventually relocating to Venice, California, where she continued to paint and where she became a member of the Ruskin Art Club. She donated a pastoral scene signed Elizabeth Borglum to our collection, a painting which we still proudly own. Borglum cast his Ruskin statue for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where he won a gold medal for his early monumental bronze, The Mares of Diomedes. But why, we ask, did Ruskin's aesthetic perspectives meet with such a fervent response in mid-19th century America? Well, again, we can't do justice to that large topic in such a short space in a single lecture, but let me suggest two reasons. One, as America emerged as an independent power in the world after the Civil War, questions naturally arose about the shape of American as opposed to European art. From the beginning of his career as an art critic, Ruskin, in his support of Turner, had attacked the straitjacket of the Academy and conventional academic standards in landscape painting. Ruskin thought that the root of art lay in the ability of the individual artist to see and engage the real world and to find there, and not in historically approved models, the sources of truth. This, of course, had its resonances in Emerson and in the Transcendentalists and in the whole theme of self-reliance, which was such a part of American life in the 19th century. Beyond strictly, the second point, beyond strictly aesthetic concerns, Ruskin's idea that art is essentially connected to social improvement and human development, not some rarefied pastime for elites, a connection central to Ruskin's thought, was deeply attractive to American interests and mores. The unity of art and life, art embracing not the realm of fantasy and diversion, but the real world, human, natural, cultural, scientific, geological, in all its dimensions. One great example of that, Joey, if you can move to the fragment of the Alps, yeah. One of Ruskin's greatest drawings, and one that had an enormous effect on American artists in the late 19th century. As John Parks notes in a 2007 article in the Artists of the Norton Circle, quote, this was the magic brew that Ruskin concocted and that American artists found utterly intoxicating. To wit, Charles Herbert Moore's Rocks by the Water, clearly the son of Ruskin's Fragment of the Alps. That brings us inevitably to the other pole of Ruskin's impact on American society, namely on the creation of craft-based and utopian communities. 3 bullet point examples. There were dozens of such experiments around the turn of the 20th century, most short-lived, lasting a year or two. But what should be noted is that most, if not all, of these American attempts had their roots in the example of the agrarian-based activities of the Guild of St. George in the UK that Ruskin founded in the 1870s, and in the craft enterprises and communities inspired by William Morris. In California, this mainly took the form of back to the land movements. For example, there are the early settlers of the Little Lands colony in Tujunga. This colony was the brainchild of William Smythe. There we go. Who had organized colonies of gardeners and small farmers in other parts of the state with the slogan, "A little land and a living." Bolton Hall in Tujunga, the community's 1913 rock-faced meeting house, is today the sole physical remnant of the Little Lands colony today, at least according to what I know. Members of the cooperative community, around 200 at its height, were urged to build their houses, plant some seed, get some goats, chickens, pigeons, and sit back and enjoy life. Shades of W.C. Fields without the oranges. This agrarian revival, what Smythe called the next passion of mankind, a passion for the soil, played into popular ideas of the time, ideas embraced by the state's publicists that California would spearhead a return of the middle class to the land. The urban bondage, so the argument ran, had run its course, and a new way of life was possible, in which modern men and women could embrace the benefits of country life and resist the evils of industrialization. Most of these attempts foundered on one stubborn fact or another. With the Little Landers, it was the most stubborn fact of all. It was rocks. After clearing stones from the valley floor and building their houses, colonists found themselves without ice, without gas to cook with or mail delivery, while livestock sickened, gophers and lizards thrived. Beneath the rocks were more rocks and more rocks. Many decided that the promise of the good life was just too hard. In Ruskin, Florida, educators experimented with new and very Ruskinian models of higher education, drawn particularly from Ruskin's years as Slade Professor of Fine Arts at Oxford, and in Ruskin, Tennessee, with a nod to Morris, more equitable relations between capital and labor. Ruskin, Florida, in the western part of the state, was developed in 1908 by two educators, Dr. George Miller and his wife Addie. In 1910, the Ruskin Common Good Society, I love that, officially incorporated the town, and the Millers presided over the Ruskin College there, which required students to do manual labor part-time in order to pay for their education and housing. However, by 1918, World War I had decimated most of the student body, and a disastrous fire finished the job, destroying the campus that same year. Miller died in 1919, and although the town survived as a farming community, the idealistic dreams of its founders did not. Ruskin, Tennessee had an even shorter and more dramatic trajectory. Founded by crusading newspaper editor and socialist reformer Julius Wayland in 1894, the Ruskin colony was one of many attempts to create model societies in rural areas which would challenge and provide a practical alternative to the American industrial system. Such colonies also functioned as an implicit criticism of the limitations of social reform based on urban models and institutions, such as organized labor. Let's move on to the strawberry pickers. There we go, from the Ruskin Cooperative. Ruskin, Tennessee lasted just 2 years before being torn apart by disputes about governance and free love, in no particular order. The monogamous majority moved to Georgia in 1896 to start anew, but disease, failed business enterprises, and poverty forced them to disband in 1901. Of all these attempts, the most substantial and durable in its aims and long-lasting effects was and is the Roycroft community in East Aurora, New York. Founded in 1895 by the colorful former soap salesman, publicist, and self-styled philosopher Elbert Hubbard, seen here, on the basis of visits to Ruskin and Morris, the Roycroft Guild, initially organized around printing and fine press publishing, soon grew into a residential community of artisans, printers, furniture makers, metalsmiths, leather workers, bookbinders, that made a notable mark on the development of American architecture and on book and interior design at the turn of the 20th century. There we go, thank you. At its height in 1910, the community boasted a population of 500, and contrary to the examples of the other communities we've cited, Roycroft in one form or another has managed to persevere, both as a colony and as a style, despite the loss of Hubbard, who in a moment of prophetic insight and not a little hubris, imagining that he could personally persuade Kaiser Wilhelm to end the war, booked himself and his wife on the Lusitania in May 1915. We had a fine conference, we've had two actually, fine conferences on Ruskin and the arts and crafts movement at Roycroft in September 2019, and also just this last couple of months ago. It's especially gratifying to witness the revival of the Roycroft Press. And this under the leadership of Joe Weber, who has made every effort to create new books in the classic Roycroft printing style, and has even managed to locate and press into service 4 of Hubbard's own printing presses. Okay, back to California. It's October 12th, 1888. We are in the parlor of Mary Boyce's house, just off Pershing Square in downtown Los Angeles. The Los Angeles of 1888, a brash city in the midst of epoch-making transitions. In 1880, the population of the city of Los Angeles was a little over 11,000. By 1890, it was more than 50,000. By the turn of the century, that figure had doubled. As California historian Kevin Starr perceptively notes, quote, "Hope for the good life glowed white hot in the 1880s, when thousands upon thousands of Pullman immigrants poured into the state in the most dramatic population growth since the gold rush. Their lives were explorations at a time of transition. Together they glimpsed an idea which yet remains a challenge and which might become a tragic irony. They dreamed of a California of nature and art, lived with dignity and celebrated in creativity. They wanted a California of health, color, warmth, and heritage. They struggled for it, all of them, even the wounded ones," end quote. It's very much in this context and in this spirit that the Ruskin Art Club was born. Joey, can you go back to the picture of Mary Boyce? Very good. Captain Henry H. Boyce, a retired Union officer, and his wife Mary, had moved to Los Angeles in 1882 in the so-called boom years, where Captain Boyce bred horses and then went on to become the business manager and then owner of the Morning Tribune in his spare time. In addition to the experience of the Civil War, an even deeper and more personal grief had driven the Boyces west. While they lived in Milwaukee before the move to California, 4 of their 5 children had died of diphtheria within a week. Mary Boyce must have seemed a very exotic figure in the social scene of Los Angeles in those days. Fascinated by the ancient Middle East, she gave her children the names of Egyptian gods and goddesses. Her daughter was named Neth Boyce. In her salons and study circles, Boyce played host to visiting scholars and writers. In Los Angeles, she hosted Crawford Hancock Toy, the eminent professor of Hebrew and Oriental languages at Harvard, and Ernest Fenollosa, the Oriental scholar who inspired the Chinese translations of Ezra Pound. An early history of the Ruskin Art Club, written in 1893, describes the club's origins this way, quote, "A few women, especially inspired by the fine collection of engravings and etchings in the home of Mrs. H. Boyce, and desiring a more intimate knowledge of black and white art, engravings in all its branches, urged Mrs. Boyce to lead a circle or club in the study of this subject. This she consented to do, giving the club free access to the rare books of her library and of superior importance, an opportunity to study the unusually fine collection of masterpieces of old line engravers of different periods," end quote. Joey, if you can move on to the front parlor. There we go, thank you. This is not Mary Boyce's parlor, but this is an exemplar of the parlors of upper class families in Los Angeles around this period. Many of Mary's friends were not only prominent citizens of boom era LA, but the spouses of the University of Southern California's founders, the creators of the cultural and educational infrastructure of the emerging city. At the first official meeting of the club, they gave it the name Ruskin. Poignantly, only a month earlier, the master himself, writing in the shadow of Chamonix, put the final touches on the new epilogue to a new edition of his first masterpiece, Modern Painters, and then retired into his long silence. The British Ruskin scholar Dinah Birch gave a talk last year at the Huntington, excuse me, where she stressed that a talk on Ruskin and women, stressed that it's significant that so many women at the turn of the 20th century found Ruskin an empowering influence. All these organizations, especially women's organizations, that found aspects of Ruskin's thought significant for their own work. In addition to the art world, we have Jane Addams and the Settlement House movement in New York that had Ruskinian roots. As Mary Boyce writes of this period in 1893, the enthusiasm which induced so detailed and prolonged study of the techniques and history of engraving will be understood when the environment of the Ruskin Art Club is considered. Los Angeles, peerless in sunshine and flowers, offers few facilities for the study of art. It has no museums. It has no galleries. Only in the domain of engraving can access be had to the original works of great artists. In the midst of the high pressure of California life, she's writing here in 1893, if she only knew, the Ruskin Art Club has made a place for leisurely and persistent investigation, end quote. Given their enthusiasm for the work of American engravers and other regional artists and civic sculptors, the club, as early as 1890, barely 2 years after its founding, had forged ties with leading American engravers and engraving societies, which resulted in the club bringing over from the Paris exhibition of 1889 the work of prize-winning American engravers exhibited there. In 1890, the Ruskin Art Club mounted a show of these engravings in the Crocker Building downtown, widely considered the first public art exhibition in Los Angeles. These annual art exhibitions, which eventually featured the work of local California painters, as well as master wood and line engravings, continued until 1905. The fact that the Ruskin Art Club devoted itself in its first years to a serious study of hand engraving and etching is instructive. There was the public access to art aspects in which etchings and prints made great art and design available to a wide public, to persons of modest means. But it went deeper than that. Early Ruskin Art Club members were not just studying art as a private leisure activity, although there is the lifelong learning aspect to note, but as part of something as large as the expansion or perhaps the recovery of human consciousness itself. Ruskin taught that beauty has an essentially moral, even redemptive function in human life, and that art is one of the principal, if not the principal ways of awakening to the real world, and in the face of industrial abstraction, recovering what it means to be an individual, what it means to be human. Evidence of the civic power of the Ruskin Art Club and other women's clubs in the city was on display in 1909, when the Women's Clubs of Los Angeles obtained a 50-year lease on what is now Exposition Park, converting it in 1913 from a racing track. There we go. This is as it was called then, Agricultural Park. This is an automobile race in what is now the Exposition Park. They obtained a 50-year lease on what is now Exposition Park, converting it in 1913 from a racing track with a well-earned reputation for vices such as gambling and prostitution into the site for the Rose Garden and Museum of History, Science, and Art, the precursor to today's Museums of Science, Natural History, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. A year later, sculptor Julia Bracken's Three Graces bronze, its globe supplied by the Judson Studios, I believe, was moved from the old City Hall to the museum's main lobby, where after many vicissitudes, it stands again today. But Los Angeles was not alone in boasting a Ruskin-oriented club in those days. The end of the 19th century was the heyday on both sides of the Atlantic of Ruskin societies, reading guilds, and associations to one degree or another dedicated to studying the works of the Victorian master, following his engagement in arts education and applying his insights to the cultural and social issues of the day. The Ruskin Club in Oakland was founded in 1898 by Frederick Irons Bamford, A.A. Dennison, and Austin Lewis, a small group of committed Bay Area socialists. This group had more on its mind than studying art. Modeled after the revolutionary clubs of the French Revolution, they were part of the large and diffuse movement then known as Christian socialism, which attracted progressives bent on radical economic and political reform. Novelist and adventurer Jack London, in his incarnation as revolutionary firebrand, the boy socialist, as he was then called, was a member and a frequent star lecturer to the club's intellectual clientele. Architect Bernard Maybeck, pioneer of the Berkeley brown shingle house, as of much else that is distinctive in Bay Area architecture, may also have had connections with the Ruskin Club, although later, with poet and Ruskin enthusiast Charles Keeler, he founded the Berkeley-based Hillside Club in 1898, still in existence, which served as a mouthpiece for Maybeck's philosophy. The Hillside Club's goal was nothing less than to turn the entire Berkeley community into a woodland garden. According to a 1981 article on Maybeck by Richard Reinhardt, quote, a gentle park-like encampment of simple homes and winding lanes, pedestrian walks, and flowering stairways, end quote. David Judson of Judson Studios called my attention to a book review in the Arroyo Craftsman of October 1909, which references the Ruskin Club of Oakland and gives us a feel for the character of the group. The review relates how the writer Herman Whitaker got his start. Landing in Oakland with a family, a wife and 7 children, but without means, the would-be writer landed a job as a grocery clerk. He met Jack London, who promptly introduced him to the members of the Ruskin Club. They concluded that the talented grocery clerk with literary ambitions was, quote, a giant in the throes of bondage, and set out to help him. Quote, at the next meeting, when Whitaker was not there, a man got up and said, we've got to relieve Whitaker of his bondage. He has power. Let us give him a chance to develop it. I'll stand his grocery bill for a year. In a moment, others leaped at the chance to give help. One pledged shoes, another clothing, and then rent, and so on until the thing was done. Then the club took Whitaker by the scruff of his neck and hauled him forth from his grocery clerking and set him down in his modest home and told him to go to work. End quote. The Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles, the Hillside Club of Berkeley, and the California Art Club, founded in 1909 by painter William Wendt and his wife, the sculptor Julia Bracken, are the survivors of those heady days and the wildfire movement of Ruskin-inspired associations in California. The Ruskin Club of Oakland disbanded abruptly in 1907, as a London biographer laments, without even winding up its affairs. I discovered recently that there is still a Ruskin Art Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that dates to the early years of the 20th century and has managed to soldier on. The Peach Blossom. The promise of the West, proclaimed with such drama by the Golden Spike, was to prove, at least in general terms, a disappointment to the large redemptive hopes of the early 20th century's California dreamers. As we have seen, redemptive hopes shaped to a more significant degree than is commonly acknowledged by Ruskin and his American followers. Despite the perceptions of 19th and 20th century Anglo-American settlers, California was not a tabula rasa upon which their dreams could be innocently realized. There were people here, and cultures, and ways of life increasingly pushed to the margins by California's pioneers. Even as the newcomers borrowed elements of local architecture and folkways to create the romantic myth of an innocent Spanish colonial past with mission themes and red tile roofs and wrought iron fixtures, but without Native Americans, Mexicans, and Catholics. Belief in progress, born of the crisis of the Civil War, had been undermined by an even greater war that broke out in 1914, a conflict that called into question the idealism that had greeted the new century with its apparently limitless possibilities and technological marvels. The dream of Victorian Los Angeles with its Bunker Hill mansions, gardens, and culture-building civic engagement had darkened by the 1930s into LA noir, a city of urban exiles, setting of the novels of Raymond Chandler, Chinatown, the corruption-ridden world of Mayor Shaw, and the architects of megalopolis and suburban sprawl. Ruskin speaks to us today for the same reasons that he spoke to our forebears a century ago, but I would argue in a different and deeper, at least a more insistent key. Our forebears turned to Ruskin in the face of systemic failure, the failure of a civilization to cohere, the Civil War, and therefore with the need to rethink, to re-examine the human enterprise from top to bottom. For that, you need radical thinkers who pose the difficult questions, who challenge the operational assumptions, and who tell you that your choices matter. Ruskin was and is such a thinker. If anything, the systemic and ecological failures of our own times appear far more threatening and urgent than the ones our forebears knew, and may require more radical and wholehearted responses than the ones they envisioned, let alone the ones they managed. In 1884, Ruskin gave an end-of-term lecture to his students at Oxford, during which he expressed disappointment in what he saw as their unstated but nevertheless firm resistance to the way of life he had proposed to them. A way of life based not on consumption, on the search for empty leisure, on the worship of the self, which renders one, Ruskin wrote, quote, an incarnate calamity to the world, end quote. All this, said Mr. Ruskin of his demands, is called impossible. It may be so. I have nothing to do with its possibility, but only with its indispensability. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. That was great. It was good to see the long version. I know you had cut your time short at the Huntington, and so it's very
Yes,
exciting to see,
in situ, I had to cut as we were going through. I enjoyed this opportunity.
yeah, I remember because I spoke after you, and I was very concerned about your length of.
But I was perfect.
Very good, yeah. Great. Well, does anybody have any questions or anything? You want to just pop on and ask Gabe a question?
Or make a comment or whatever.
This is Louise, and I would like to say I just found that absolutely fascinating. I knew that Ruskin never came to the States, but I really didn't understand the extent of his influence. And I'm just so chuffed, as we say, to learn the extent of his influence. It's wonderful. Thank you.
One of the people I didn't mention who certainly broadcast Ruskin's ideas in a most original way was, of course, Oscar Wilde, who Wilde came in, 1888, I believe, to the United States as part of a publicity campaign for Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience, in which Ruskin is lampooned as Reginald Bunthorne. And the producers of the musical thought it would be a great publicity coup if they could get Wilde over to America to boost audience interest in the New York run of Patience. So Wilde ended up using the opportunity to give, over a period of a year and a half, something like 140 lectures all over the United States and Canada, including to miners in Leadville, Colorado, on Shakespeare. And the central lecture that he gave was a lecture called the English Renaissance of Art. Last year, we had Ruskin scholar Robert Hewison here, and Hewison went to the Clark Library, where they have the actual manuscript notes of Wilde's lecture tour. And he was looking for something in particular. And he got the notes out. He took him like 5 minutes as he looked through the notes, and he says, aha, I've got him. He said, Wilde lifted almost all of this lecture from modern painters, from Ruskin, first volume of Modern Painters. Whole pages had just been lifted out of Ruskin. But nevertheless, in his own inimitable way, Wilde popularized some of Ruskin's ideas in the United States. Wilde did.
I'm curious to know if there was any. I'm Stephen White.
Yes.
Enjoyed this very much. It was really interesting. But I'm curious to know if the Ruskin Art Club's affiliated with any other groups in the States? Because, for example, I know Ted Bosley and I are both in the Zamorano Club. And we have affiliations with other book clubs around the country. And I wondered if these have always been kind of lone wolves, or if they've actually interacted with other clubs, or if there are similar clubs to the Ruskin Art Club.
Well, it's interesting. In the early years of the club, there was a lot of, when it was a women's club, there were a lot of, there was and it wasn't every year, maybe it was every 5 years, there was an assembly of women's clubs. There was a kind of loose national federation of women's clubs. So there were a lot of institutional ties in those early years. Not so much as the club developed, but more recently, we are certainly involved in the new Ruskin Society of North America, which is being created. Now we're very much involved with the Guild of St. George in the UK. And we are, again, these are still informal relationships, but we work very closely with the Roycroft community too, East Aurora, New York, and are looking to expand, those relationships. I think that the trend now, since there's a revival of interest in Ruskin in the UK, there's a big revival of interest in Ruskin in the United States. There's also a revival of Ruskin's interest in Ruskin in Japan, where there's long been Ruskin societies in Japan, which is interesting. There's a whole century of tradition of Ruskin groups in Japan. So I think, given the ability to connect now, I think there's a real move to see what kinds of collaborations we can build. I think we're certainly the Ruskin Art Club today we're certainly much more involved with advertising the lectures, the virtual events of other Ruskin groups, and presenting them as ways to enrich our own members. So I think this is only going to grow in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Maya Trachimczyk. I'm here in Sunland. Sunland Tahanga is where the Little Landers Historical Society was founded in 1959 to preserve the memory of the Little Landers themselves and to restore Bolton Hall Museum. It was a complete ruin in 59. They bought it, they restored it for volunteers, worked until 1980 it opened the door as a museum. And there's a lot of programs, a lot of activities artistically here in the boondocks, as we call it. There we have a lot of artists living here, a lot of poets living here. So there's something in the air of the Ruskin tradition right in our neighborhood. We have a poet laureate program of Samantahanga, which very few areas have in LA. So this is just to mention. But I was also thinking about Helena Modrzewska, Polish actress who came to America with a group of friends, artists, who decided to start an art colony of sorts and live on the land in Orange County. They bought a place and they had a farm it's called Arden now, belongs to the county. It's a historic home, but I don't think anybody ever studied the impact of Ruskin's ideas and this kind of utopian ideas, artists working off the land and, having their own bees and having their own honey and orchards and animals and whatnot. And of course, that dream was crushed by the complete lack of knowledge about climate and agriculture by all these artists. So Modrzewska came back to the stage and started a triumphant march through the stages in America, starting from 1875 until her death practically in 1909. She was living with a base in Arden in Orange County and then traveling around the world. So nobody ever explored the connection here and the impact here. It would be something worthwhile, as well as I don't think we should say that it's just a field of rocks is what remains from Little Landers. It's a lot of more, I think. A big tradition of art in the foothills.
Yes. Yes, the Tahanga ended up being fruitful, not so much in farming, but in poetry and the arts. Yes. You know, it's
And I wonder also that why would John Stephen McGraorty settle here? He bought a mansion on the hills of Tahanga and he lived here from 1920s, I think, and he became California Poet Laureate 1933 to 1944. He was in local politics as well and published a lot of stuff and wrote plays. So that connection could also be explored if McGraorty was also inspired. His library is still there in a center. You can just walk in and look at his books and his desk and everything else. It's still intact. So that'll be something also to add a little bit, because some of these things kind of metamorphose. The Landers themselves, the little group, this kind of drifted away, but the tradition of keeping people together with a community, with the arts and poetry and painting and everything else remained.
That's it. Well, as we said, some of these influences that Ruskin had on various American movements some of it was direct in some cases, but much of it was indirect. You know, it was just kind of in the air, and people took inspiration from it.
Any other questions? Jennifer Morris had mentioned that Jim Spatz sends his best. He couldn't make it tonight, Gabe, but I don't know if you've spoken to him. I'm sure he's still recovering. And
I was also going to say, you know, this was a time of city building. And I mean, there were utopian societies throughout California, but the founders of Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland and all they were bringing paintings around the Cape. They were building the homes that they knew on the East Coast. They were building the harbor. They were building downtown. So there was a real freedom and yet they were using the land. They were building orange groves and orchards and living off the land. And it was a real time of abundance in California, and a very idealistic time. So it's the Ruskin influence is brought here along with so many different kind of cultures and influences that created California.
Gabriel, I have a question. This is Greg Tedesco. I was curious about the inspiration in terms of the arts and crafts movement, if there was any connection to Spanish tile and California tile and ceramic works, because that's one of the things I think that sort of distinguishes our region in that period. I couldn't help but think about that.
Yeah, well, there's a theme in Ruskin that strongly urges that builders use the stone and the colors, the natural colors of a region in constructing their architecture. So that idea has had enormous influence on 20th century and 21st century values. Yeah, so Ruskin was very much into you don't build medieval castles. In California, you think about what stone you have here and the colors of the natural terrain, and you create architectural styles and features out of those organic elements.
The railroads were really what promoted a lot of that. The building stone was the second largest industry in California, next to the gold rush in the 1880s. And there were quarries all over this country, all over California, up in Folsom, and many quarries that are now, you'll see lemon groves that have developed over them, but and those little railroad connections are pretty much gone. But a lot of the even the tiles, but the stone was imported from Arizona and all over the state, and it was a huge boon to California.
So one of the great ironies that you alluded to, Gabriel, in talking about the Little Landers is that the Back to the Land movement was, for many who embraced it, not going back to the land, but going to the land for the first time as novices, as innocents, and discovering rocks.
Stubborn facts.
And it was no different for Charles Robert Ashby in the Cotswolds, where he took his Eastenders back to the country, as he said, and they had a hard time. Well, fitting in, for one thing. They were a curiosity.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there were enough. I guess the Little Landers were a curiosity to the animals that ranged, and maybe still do, I think.
The lizards and the gophers,
yeah. But that was one of the it's one of the wonderful contradictions of the arts and crafts movement, is this this strong desire to go back to the land, whether you'd ever been there or not, and especially for people from the city.
Mm-hmm. One of the less remarked on themes in Ruskin's work is the whole notion of the need to create a rural economy, a genuine rural economy. It's not enough for urban people to go to the country and live an urban life, or a life with urban assumptions. That what really has to happen is you have to restore a genuinely rural economy, which is not an urban economy. It's a different, and it involves relationships, and involves recalibrating the whole way that you live. I know in the UK, one of the things that the Guild of St. George is involved in is seeking to, trying to experiment with ways of restoring a rural economy in the Bewdley area, which is kind of in the middle of the UK, where Ruskin, to prevent developers, miners in particular, coal miners, from coming in and destroying a magnificent forest in that area, he bought it in the 1870s. And so the Guild owns this 100 acres of forest. So they've been able to use that now as a kind of base to begin to think about, how do we rebuild for the county a genuinely rural economy? What ways can, for example, they're just exploring what ways can Bewdley's it's beautiful, but it's a sort of dead end place in a way. And so a lot of young people there are, feel like they're in some kind of dead end. So what they've been doing is trying to pull a lot of young people into work in forest clearing, in keeping bees, in being involved with this project, and they're actually having a lot of success. But I think Ruskin would always say to us, it's more than just going to your 5 acres, that you have to think about it in this far more holistic way. It's really living a different way.
Gabriel, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you, Gabriel. This has been so fantastic, and you're echoing a theme that Sir David Attenborough has been working on for many years, but that we all need to pay attention to, the holistic view of the world. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tyson.
Oh, just that I think you hit upon an interesting tension that we have here in America between the rural and the divide between the rural and the urban here. And there was a lot of talk in this last election about reaching out, the urban people reaching out to the rural. How do we rebuild the rural? But a lot of that conversation seems to be about, well, how do we say build high tech or manufacturing there, which is really not certainly not what Ruskin had in mind, is bringing the urban to the rural. So I think that's a conversation that's ongoing here in America, is just how do we build up the rural, but not do it in a way that destroys the rural?
Right. Well, that was a discussion that they were having in Ruskin's day.
Exactly.
What Ruskin critiques is that you had kind of nouveau riche industrialists deciding that they wanted a country home. And so they would go to the country and they'd buy some great pile. And what he would say is that that estate had relationships with local people. Local people lived on the land, and local people were tenant farmers, and people had centuries of connection to that house. And the industrialists would come and they would fire all the staff, get rid of the tenant farmers, so they could effectively live a life built on urban assumptions in the country. And so, I mean, that was a tension, you know, even in Ruskin's days. He saw it kind of on the other end, an established but unraveling rural life, you know, being further unraveled by kind of urban assumptions, which is why he talked about the necessity to rethink, to reimagine what a rural economy would genuinely look like, including the relationships of the people to the land and people to each other and all of that.
It's interesting though, because today, just going back to this political aspect, the rural people don't trust the city people. I mean, there's this whole thing about now with the election being fake, and a lot of that's coming out of the rural areas, and they're seeing the cities as being full of elitists, and they don't consider themselves elitists. So all kinds of issues have evolved out of this that really are taking us farther apart rather than bringing us together.
I would point out there was a really great arts patron who passed away the last couple of years, Frank Wiley, who struggled with this. He you know, made a fortune with Wiley Laboratories, and he was a patron of Rico Lebrun and Howard Warshaw, and commissioned murals of theirs, and he also commissioned my father as an architect for many projects. And he bought, I believe it was 4,000 acres. It was a huge plot out by Merced when UC Merced was planned. And he was not, you know, particularly elitist. He was a very democratic fellow, and he wanted to be part of that economy and eventually develop the land. And he ran cattle, and he tried to bring employment there, but it was a difficult, you know, proposition. And I think the furniture factory that he tried there failed, not for lack of good design. I can't remember exactly the history, but it's an interesting dialogue back and forth between wealth coming out of cities and going to urban areas, and then how that interaction takes place. You know, certainly the kind of stereotype of the gentleman farmer lends itself to high elitism. And I think one of the problems with, you know, if you're a gentleman farmer who's a capitalist who doesn't like having employees, well, you're going to not be able to manage the land. You have to be able to get along with your labor. So it's an interesting thing. And I think there's also a contrast there to the extent that, you know, these cooperatives had socialist ideas. Well, if you've only got a few socialists, but, you know, if you've got 10 socialists, but you need 100 people to run the farm, you have a big shortage of labor.
Yeah.
Again, if all of this was easy, we would have plenty of examples of success, which we don't have. One of the thinkers who's particularly, I think, insightful about all this, because he's trying to do it, is Wendell Berry. the poet Wendell Berry, who's writes in a very Ruskinian way. He's read Ruskin. Ruskin's a part of his toolkit in a way. But Berry's quite a unique figure in this, in that he talks about the viability of the rural perspective in itself. It's a whole way of living and thinking and being in the world. So Berry's, I think, often a very insightful source for someone who's really engaging with this directly as a farmer.
There's a New Yorker article that was written, I think, a couple of years ago now, interviewing Wendell Berry, and touches on these exact themes, and you know, kind of having him address where the disconnect is happening. And he's very insightful. It's a very good article. If you can track it down, it's really good.
There's also a documentary, and Tyson, you've got a better memory than I have. When we did the Wendell Berry Symposium, which was in 2018, we showed the documentary that Berry made, which is marvelous because it really isn't about Berry so much. It's not like a documentary on the farmer poet. There's a bit of that, but it's really about his county and the problems that the farmers there faced, from agribusiness and being tempted into that, and then trying to regroup as organic farmers. You remember what the? Whoop,
yeah, I'm posting it in chat right now.
And Joseph just posted the New Yorker article for those that are interested in the article.
Oh yeah, look and see. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's available broadly, so I think, as far as I know, it's out there. So it's a wonderful film. Look and see. Again, what I found so impressive about it was I expected it to be a portrait of Berry and his life, and it was much more impressive than that, because it was really talking about the context in which he worked and lived.
Great. Well, thank you everybody tonight, and thank you, Dave. Fantastic talk and bringing it home, so to speak.
Yeah. Happy to be doing the unexpurgated version.
Yeah. And we'll be hearing about the next talk coming up soon. Do we have anything scheduled at this point?
Well, one thing I wanted to know, will you tell us a little bit about what you're doing on December 9th? The Forest Lawn?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll be speaking to the curator who put the show together with the Forest Lawn collection. So it's an exhibition of stained glass from Judson Studios, from our very beginnings to our more recent artist collaborations, mixed in with their collection of stained glass, medieval stained glass that was part of the Hearst collection. They have a fantastic collection of art glass up there, and so. The curator is super frustrated because he's been trying to open the exhibit now since several months. Yeah, and so with no luck, and it doesn't look like it's going in the right direction, right? So, but we'll be speaking with Steffi Nelson, who helped me write the book on Judson, and himself, and talking about kind of some of the installations around Los Angeles and the history of Judson, and some of the collection at the Forest Lawn Museum. So
that's December 9th?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's what we can find out about, or link onto it through your website? Or?
Yeah, I think it's just gone out today. Actually, I haven't seen it myself, but I think we can, if we can post it through Ruskin, that'd be great. We can.
We'll do that. That's okay. Great. Just a couple of things I thought I would just mention, since we are approaching the end of this momentous 2020. It's still not over, but one holds one's breath. But in 2021, I thought I would encourage us a little bit. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the events that we're already working and negotiating with. In January, we're going to have another one of these conferences. So we're working on dates, but it's a Zoom conference on Ruskin, work, and creativity in a time of crisis. This will be a whole conference on work. The centerpiece of it will be the Ruskin Lecture for 2021, which we do every year, given by Elizabeth Garlow of Lumina Foundation, who managed the President's Promise Zones initiative during the Obama administration. She's really quite good on this. And so she'll be there along with Dr. Marcus Waith from the UK, from Cambridge, who's a major Ruskin scholar with an interest in work, philosophy of work and craft. Also, we're doing a concert, probably in February, with the Zelter Quartet, our favorite string quartet, which did the Sarah Rogers King of the Golden River piece for us at the Huntington. They're working on a concert for us, a string quartet concert for us in February. We also have a tour of the exhibition Crafting America at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, which we are going to be having a curated tour of this amazing exhibition in February. And then we're also, as a result of our previous conversations where a number of people were eager to see the remarkable collection of Kelmscott Press, of Morris's Kelmscott Press at the Clark Library, we are negotiating for them for a 2021 exhibition for us of their Kelmscott Press run. So I think that's going to happen. And finally, just the second annual Ruskin Lecture at Notre Dame University. We will be zooming into that, sponsored by the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. The focus of the conference will be on Ruskin and the humanities, and I will be giving the lecture. So love to have you all join us on Ruskin's birthday, February 8th, for the Notre Dame conference. So those are just a few things ahead for us.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, thank you. And if you want more information, ruskinartclub.com. You can find all of those listings, and you can sign up. If you're not a member, you can sign up to be a member on that website as well. And I want to thank the Denenbergs for sending out the invitations. Joey, thanks for your help tonight with the slideshow. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great Thanksgiving,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Goodbye.